At the core of every medical facility, there's a unique domain, a space where the boundary between existence and the unknown is often unclear. The intensive care unit, ICU, is where humanity's most fragile instances occur. Here, the constant drone of life-sustaining equipment, the regular pulse of monitors, and the quiet yet omnipresent strain in the atmosphere generate a unique setting. It's an environment where each inhalation is significant, every pulse is monitored, and where the erratic nature of life becomes undeniable. For ICU nurses, this setting is simultaneously a field of conflict and a place of refuge. They traverse this realm with unmatched proficiency, empathy, and understanding. These are the individuals who confront injury, disease, and mortality on a daily basis, observing the most intense feelings of those in their care and their loved ones. Yet, despite their experience, even veteran nurses acknowledge that certain occurrences surpass medical understanding. Sometimes, amidst life preservation efforts and the rapid pace, there are instances that are inexplicable. This presentation compiles actual experiences shared by ICU nurses who have faced such phenomena during their professional lives. Their accounts are not just of medical irregularities, but of strange, memorable, and alarming incidents that remain vivid long after the patient has departed. As the presentation progresses, you'll hear about unusual events that can't be attributed to stress or weariness, moments that challenge the limits of what we believe. This isn't solely about the successes and difficulties of nursing. It's about the obscure, the uncanny, and the disquieting events that elude scientific explanation. Some nurses who have lived through these occurrences have even doubted their own mental stability, yet the accounts endure. So, as you observe, be ready to reconsider the calm, seemingly ordinary night duties and the dim areas of medical facilities you've never questioned. It was during one of those initial shifts, when the night had recently transitioned to dawn and the eye was serene, excessively so. The gentle pulse of the equipment, the infrequent rustle of movement in the corridor, and the muted hum of the climate control system permeated the atmosphere. Otherwise, the medical facility felt almost deserted. I was at the nursing station reviewing my evening's records when I detected it. Initially, I believed it was merely my imagination deceiving me due to tiredness. It was subtle, almost a murmur, a neonate's wail, delicate, far off, yet distinct. I hesitated, attempting to identify the origin of the sound. It wasn't the typical sound one would anticipate in an ICU. There were no infants in the ward, certainly not at this time. It was entirely geriatric patients, adults grappling with grave ailments. Nevertheless, the wail persisted, growing slightly more audible, as if originating from just beyond the hallway. I arose swiftly, my pulse accelerating. I pursued the sound down the dimly illuminated corridor, each footfall seeming weightier than the preceding one. The sound directed me to room 312, a chamber that had remained unoccupied for an extended period. Nothing but a silent bed with no occupant. I unlocked the door, my heart constricting my throat, and entered, surveying the space rapidly. No infant, no indication of life other than the standard medical apparatus. No wailing either. The chamber was strangely quiet. I lingered there for a moment, anticipating. The quietness felt nearly excessive. I examined the record for the chamber. No neonates were documented as patients in that location. It defied logic, yet the wail remained vivid in my mind, reverberating in my ears. I retreated back into the corridor, attempting to rationalize it. Perhaps I had merely envisioned it. Fatigue, tension, perhaps even a form of sensory excess. However, I then recalled something, A rumor had been spreading among the personnel for months. It had commenced as a hushed remark in the leisure area, a nurse stating she had detected a neonate wailing late one evening. She believed she had been hallucinating, perhaps merely weary after a prolonged shift. However, others began to disclose analogous experiences, voices of neonates wailing, delicate and remote, in the depths of the night, when the ward was supposed to be silent. I couldn't help but feel the hairs on my nape bristle. It was implausible, yet it felt remarkably genuine. I resolved to inquire, to ascertain if anyone else had detected it as well. The more I conversed with the personnel, the more I comprehended that I wasn't alone. Numerous nurses had detected the identical sound at varying times, consistently in the identical sector of the ICU. Subsequently, one of the senior nurses, who had been employed here for an extended period, mentioned something that chilled me. She recounted that months prior, a neonate had been admitted, critically ill and fighting for survival. Despite everyone's utmost endeavors, the neonate succumbed in that very chamber. It had been a devastating incident, and the family had endured unfathomable anguish. Ever since that evening, she stated softly, individuals have detected the wailing. I'm uncertain if it's merely tension or something additional, but I've detected it myself. Occasionally it's more audible, at other times more subdued, but it's invariably present. I couldn't disregard it any longer. The wailing sound, the unoccupied chamber, the disquieting sensation that lingered. It wasn't merely my imagination. Something was present. Something had left an imprint. And perhaps it wasn't merely the medical facility, but the echoes of life that had once struggled in that very space, refusing to dissipate. Later that week, I revisited room 312, simply to re-examine. The door creaked as I entered, and for a fleeting moment I believed I detected it. The faint wail, the delicate, fractured sound of a neonate vocalizing. But upon entering, there was solely quietness, only the sterile, frigid walls of the chamber that had witnessed so much affliction and bereavement. In the ICU, we're accustomed to sounds, equipment pulsating, the muted undertones of dialogues, and the occasional moan or sigh from a patient. However, some sounds are incongruous. They defy logic, and yet at times they appear to endure long after the body has departed. Echoes from the past, from lives that were forfeited, from struggles that no one can obliterate. We dismiss these occurrences. After all, it's simpler to attribute it to tension, exhaustion, or even a deception of the mind. However, in those tranquil moments, in the stillness of the night, I can't help but ponder. What if those sounds aren't merely our minds deceiving us? What if they are genuinely echoes lingering around the space where life once battled to endure, where the faintest wail still refuses to dissipate? Greetings, companions. We appreciate your viewership. A special acknowledgement to our subscribers. You sustain these uncanny narratives. However, there's a detail. Merely 30% of viewers are subscribed. If you appreciate our material, subscribing aids us more than you realize. It requires a moment, but yields a significant impact. While you're engaged, like and share to maintain the suspense. We express our gratitude once more. You facilitated this. We anticipate your presence in the subsequent one, if you're courageous. I was newly qualified when I accepted a role in a novel ICU. The type of employment that would challenge my abilities, extend my forbearance, and test my resilience. I had heard the customary narratives from the other nurses, phantom tales that seemed to circulate with each new staff member. They were invariably shared in hushed tones around coffee interludes, or when the unit was more tranquil than usual. However, there was one narrative that persisted, one that I couldn't dismiss. It concerned a former nurse, Megan, who had been employed in the ICU many years prior. She was esteemed a veteran in the domain, until one catastrophic evening, when she perished in a vehicular collision while on duty, hurrying to return after a prolonged shift. They stated she was still in her medical attire when the incident transpired. The news was impactful, particularly in a close-knit unit such as ours. However, the aspect that haunted the staff wasn't merely the incident. It was the conviction that her specter lingered. The rumors asserted she had unfinished affairs, and some nurses even purported to have observed her in the corridors late at night. Some stated her specter traversed the ICU, visiting chambers, occasionally extending solace to patients, at other times cautioning those who were employed there. I didn't believe in such notions. Not genuinely. I was merely focused on executing my duties, acclimating to the cadence of the unit, learning from my associates, and dedicating the extensive hours. However, then something transpired that caused me to question everything. It was a particularly tranquil night shift. I was operating alone in the rear office, catching up on charts and generating notes. The medical facility was predominantly still, patients slumbering, nurses and physicians occupied in their respective sections. It was an opportune time to conclude some managerial tasks. However, my serenity was short-lived. I sensed the vibration of my pager. Initially, I dismissed it, considering these devices were notorious for malfunctioning. However, when I peered down at the display, I froze. The message was concise, yet it was distinct. It stated, "Is your mother well? I'm present." I blinked, re-examining it. My heart skipped a beat. How did anyone know about my mother? She had passed away just a few weeks prior. The medical facility staff had been compassionate, but this was excessively specific, excessively intimate. I swiftly dismissed it, rationalizing that it must have been some anomaly in the system, some arbitrary text that had been dispatched to the incorrect pager. However, then another message arrived, this time even more disquieting. "You're in chamber 305, the identical location I was in. Room 305, my designated chamber for the evening. I had been operating in that chamber for hours, monitoring a patient who was stable yet critical. I hadn't communicated with anyone regarding my assignment, and the messages, well, they persisted. Don't be apprehensive. I'm merely verifying on you. They'll comprehend shortly." My blood turned icy. I couldn't elucidate it. I believed I was envisioning things, perhaps still overwhelmed by bereavement. However, regardless of how many times I examined the pager or attempted to deactivate it, the messages continued. They were composed with an urgency, as if whoever was dispatching them was privy to something I wasn't. I couldn't endure it any longer. I exited into the corridor, my mind racing. I inquired of one of the senior nurses, a woman who had been employed here for years, if she was aware of anything concerning the narrative surrounding Megan. Her countenance became grave as she regarded me. "Oh, Megan. She operated in chamber 305, she stated softly. That was her final shift. She passed away that evening, en route back after her shift concluded. Some of us believe her spirit never departed this unit. She was an excellent nurse. She cared profoundly for her patients. Perhaps she still does." I felt my heart plummet. The hairs on my nape bristled as the nurse continued. "We hear things occasionally, messages, murmurs. Nurses who have been employed here long enough have all encountered it. Megan never genuinely departed. She remains in this unit, supervising us." I was in disbelief. I had been operating in the identical chamber where she perished, and the messages on my pager were becoming increasingly challenging to dismiss. Was it genuinely her? Was it plausible that Megan's spirit was attempting to communicate with me? The subsequent few nights, I couldn't dismiss the sensation that I was being observed. It wasn't as if someone was physically present. It was more akin to a presence, a weight, in the atmosphere. And each time I entered chamber 305, I sensed it. The air seemed slightly colder, the quietness slightly more profound. It was as if Megan was still present, still supervising the chamber where she had last operated. Somewhere deep within me, I comprehended that the messages on my pager weren't a coincidence. Megan's specter was still lingering in the ICU, attempting to reach out. Perhaps she had unfinished affairs. Perhaps she merely desired to communicate to someone that she was still present, still an integral part of this location. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was endeavoring to console me in the sole manner she comprehended. The more I contemplated it, the more I comprehended that I wasn't alone in my experiences. Other nurses had sensed it as well. Those tranquil, inexplicable moments where you sensed the presence of someone who wasn't there. I wasn't the sole individual to receive peculiar messages or detect things at night. And I wasn't the sole individual who had ever sensed the profound, disquieting sensation that a former nurse was still supervising the ICU, safeguarding the patients and staff in her own tranquil manner. Following that, each time I entered chamber 305, I couldn't help but ponder if Megan was still present, still operating, still caring. Even in demise, her spirit might never have fully transitioned. However, somehow, I didn't mind. It was as if she had become an integral part of the ICU itself, a component of the medical facility's essence that would never genuinely dissipate. And whenever my pager vibrated, I would smile softly to myself. I comprehended it wasn't a malfunction. It was Megan, still observing over us all. Hey, you've reached this juncture, but the narrative isn't concluded. The shadows still murmur, and the verity is concealed more profoundly than you conceive. If you cease now, you'll never ascertain what lurks just beyond the subsequent click. The ensuing narrative awaits. Observe it now before it observes you. There are patients who arrive and depart, individuals who traverse our care, and their presence is sensed, but they don't invariably leave an indelible mark. However, then there are those patients, the ones that you can't dismiss, regardless of how diligently you endeavor. I recall one such patient distinctly. Her name was Mrs. Harris. She had been in the ICU for a few weeks, and to anyone else, she appeared as merely another geriatric woman grappling with her well-being. However, to me, there was something distinct about her. Each time I verified on her, she would be reclining in bed, gazing upward at the ceiling. Her eyes never blinked, never shifted. It wasn't merely the immobility that affected me. It was the fervor of her gaze. It was as if she was perceiving something that wasn't present, something none of us could perceive. She didn't vocalize. She didn't generate a sound. However, somehow, when I would approach her, she would shift her eyes, regarding me with such lucidity, as if she was fully cognizant of everything that was transpiring. I'd endeavor to converse with her, inquire if she required anything, but she would never respond. It wasn't that she was unresponsive. No, she would elevate an eyebrow or slightly shift her fingers in a manner that conveyed to me she was endeavoring to communicate. But still, she didn't vocalize. She merely observed the ceiling with such concentration, as if something was transpiring there that I couldn't comprehend. One night, I was designated to her care. The ICU was tranquil. The night shift invariably possesses that stillness to it. The majority of the patients were slumbering, and the medical facility seemed to respire with the cadence of the equipment. However, Mrs. Harris, she was wide awake, as customary, her eyes fixated on the ceiling, unshifting. I felt uneasy. There was something in her gaze that felt almost unnatural. I peered at the ceiling, but naturally there was nothing present, merely the customary fluorescent illumination, the muted hum of the equipment above her. But still, I couldn't dismiss the sensation that she was gazing at something, someone, that wasn't in the chamber. My heart commenced to race. I endeavored to dismiss the notion, rationalizing that I was being unduly apprehensive. After all, it was a prolonged shift, and perhaps the fatigue was affecting me. I examined her vitals, ensured everything was in order, and commenced to exit the chamber. However, just prior to my departure, I turned back to regard her once more. Her gaze hadn't shifted, but then something peculiar transpired. Her eyes gradually shifted to meet mine, and for the briefest moment, it felt as if she was endeavoring to convey something to me, not with verbiage, but with that fervent, unwavering stare. I sensed a chill permeate me. It was as if her eyes were articulating. I'm not merely observing the ceiling. I'm observing something additional. I couldn't elucidate it. I'd observed numerous patients over the years. But this was distinct. I possessed a premonition in my core that I couldn't dismiss. I didn't know what she was observing or whom she was seeking, but I couldn't deny that there was something beyond the corporeal realm in that chamber with her. Hours later, as the night subsided, I returned to her chamber to verify on her once more. I discovered her still in the identical posture, eyes fixated on the ceiling. The equipment surrounding her was tranquil, and the chamber felt more ponderous than usual. However, there was no motion, no blinking, no sound. Mrs. Harris was still as if congealed in time. I lingered there for a moment, observing her. Subsequently, I exited to update the nurse's log, and that's when I was apprised Mrs. Harris had passed away just hours following my departure from her chamber. I didn't know how to process it, but what perturbed me most was when the personnel corroborated that she had not shifted, blinked, or vocalized the entire duration she was in the chamber. Not once, not even when I was present. It was as if she had been clutching onto something, anticipating something, and when it ultimately arrived, she relinquished. It wasn't the fact that she had passed that left me unsettled. It was the manner she had been observing, as if she were anticipating someone or something that no one else could perceive. Some patients linger in peculiar manners, as if they are in a trance, ensnared between realms. I've invariably pondered, particularly following that night, if Mrs. Harris was genuinely observing the ceiling, or if she was observing something beyond our comprehension. Perhaps she was anticipating someone to materialize, or perhaps she was observing something far more significant than any of us could ever comprehend. However, I'll never forget her, the manner she observed, the manner she appeared to be anticipating something unseen. It was as if, in those final moments, she was privy to something that we couldn't. Perhaps we're not as solitary as we conceive. Perhaps some presences, are invariably observing. The medical facility can be a tranquil location following the flurry of the day. I had just concluded my shift, depleted from traversing and endeavoring to maintain everything in order. It was one of those nights when everything felt more ponderous than usual, the type of shift where your physique feels as if it's operating on autopilot. I had just concluded verifying on all my patients and was reclining in the leisure area, endeavoring to unwind for a moment prior to departing for home. The night was still. There was no sound save for the occasional pulsation of equipment down the corridor. It was almost uncanny how serene it was for that time of night. I arose from the chair, prepared to conclude the last of my rounds prior to clocking out. I had to verify on chamber 305. As I traversed the corridor, I passed unoccupied chambers and dimmed illumination. I attained the door of chamber 305, where a geriatric man had been reposing quietly for the preceding few days. He had been somewhat unresponsive lately, but nothing had seemed disconcerting, merely the gradual progression of senescence. I unlocked the door quietly, not desiring to perturb him. However, as soon as I entered, something felt incongruous. It wasn't the chamber itself. The equipment was still humming quietly. The air felt still but not disagreeable. What caught me unawares was this abrupt sensation, this peculiar feeling, almost as if someone was standing excessively proximate behind me. I dismissed it as fatigue, rationalizing perhaps I was merely excessively weary following the prolonged night. However, then, I sensed it, a frigidity, an icy sensation, akin to a hand, frigid as ice, gently resting on my shoulder. My respiration caught in my throat. I froze for a moment, believing I was envisioning it. But the frigidity persisted. It wasn't a draft. It wasn't something explicable. It felt akin to a genuine hand, a solid, unyielding pressure that caused the hairs on my neck to bristle. I turned swiftly, but the chamber was unoccupied. No one was present. I re-examined the surroundings. The man on the bed was still there, reclining in his customary posture, serene, though he seemed slightly more still than prior. However, there was no one else in the chamber. I lingered there for a moment, endeavoring to process what had just transpired. I could still sense the frigid spot on my shoulder, almost as if it had permeated my integument. I elevated my hand to touch the spot, but it felt amiss. It felt colder than the remainder of my physique, as if something wasn't quite accurate. I didn't know what to deduce from it. It was excessively genuine to disregard, yet there was no elucidation. The night continued, and I concluded my rounds, but I couldn't dismiss the sensation. It lingered with me, that icy touch that wouldn't depart. The spot on my shoulder remained frigid for hours, well into my commute home. I couldn't cease contemplating it. The ensuing morning, as I arrived for my shift, I overheard one of the physicians conversing with the family. I wasn't supposed to be eavesdropping, but I overheard the verbiage that caused my stomach to contort. The patient in chamber 305, the one I had just verified on, had passed away peacefully that night, just following the conclusion of my shift. I didn't know what to conceive. The frigid touch, the inexplicable sensation. It all commenced to coalesce, but it didn't alleviate my apprehension. Some facet of me desired to believe it was merely fatigue or tension from a prolonged night, but deep within, I comprehended it was something additional. The sensation didn't dissipate. It persisted with me for days. It was as if whatever that presence was had left an imprint, something that couldn't be elucidated by the corporeal realm. It lingered, akin to a memento that some occurrences surpass what we can perceive and touch. The physique might not sense the presence of the deceased, but certain sensations, some of them appeared to transcend the physical. They persist even after the pulse has ceased, and occasionally they don't merely vanish. They linger quietly until you can't help but recall. It was akin to any other bustling day, the patients, the routines, the perpetual flux of tasks. I was accustomed to it by now, the cadence of the ICU, the constant pulsation of monitors, the muted undertones of physicians and nurses traversing. Everything felt customary, and everything felt foreseeable. I was concluding my rounds when I peered at the timepiece. It was nearly time for my shift to conclude. The final stretch invariably felt like the most arduous. Everyone was becoming weary, depleting energy, and the medical facility, in a peculiar manner, felt as if it was retaining its respiration as we all awaited the shift alteration. As the minutes elapsed, I concluded my ultimate tasks, double-verified patient records, and prepared to depart. The fluorescent illumination flickered above, casting a steady luminosity over everything, and the hum of equipment permeated the backdrop. I seized my satchel, gestured to the other nurses, and proceeded toward the egress. It was the customary routine, nothing exceptional, until I exited the ICU portals. That's when the peculiar sensation impacted. It was akin to a disquieting feeling, a muted, nagging in the recesses of my mind. But I couldn't identify why. The moment I secured the door behind me and ventured out into the cool nocturnal air, the feeling merely intensified. It was as if something wasn't quite accurate. It was that identical sensation you experience when you neglect whether you secured the door or not, but more fervent, as if a fragment of actuality had been disconnected. I endeavored to dismiss it, rationalizing perhaps I was merely weary. After all, I had been operating for hours on end. However, as I reclined in bed, endeavoring to slumber, I couldn't cease replaying those final moments of my shift. I couldn't recall departing. I couldn't recall the final hour of the night, the moments preceding my exit. It was as if a segment of my life had dissipated into thin air. I relegated it to the recesses of my mind as effectively as I could, attributing it to exhaustion. However, when I entered the leisure area the ensuing morning, everything came surging back. The dialogue, the casual discourse with my associates. It all felt as if it transpired in a parallel dimension. They conversed as if it were merely another day. They articulated as if nothing had altered. However, for me, it was distinct. The final hour of my shift didn't feel as if it had transpired at all. I endeavored to inquire, but no one seemed perturbed. No one seemed to detect anything was amiss. You departed when your shift was concluded, just as you invariably do, they conveyed to me, as though it were the most customary occurrence in the cosmos. However, I comprehended it wasn't customary. I comprehended something had transpired, and though I couldn't quite pinpoint it, I couldn't dismiss the sensation that time had elongated and contorted in those forfeited moments. Was it fatigue, tension, or was something additional transpiring? It felt as if my own perception of time had deceived me, leaving me interrogating not merely the final few hours of my shift, but the very essence of actuality itself. Time progresses distinctly in the ICU. Time is distorted, and occasionally even the most seasoned nurses, individuals who've witnessed it all, can't rationalize the moments that elude unobserved. We can't invariably elucidate what transpires, and occasionally, we don't even desire to know. All we can endeavor is to persevere. However, the subsequent time you misplace track of time or sense, as if something's absent, recall, in locations such as the ICU, actuality doesn't invariably function as we anticipate it to.